Hello, welcome to this second lunch break webinar. Today we're going to show you how to use priorities and integrate with emergency systems. My name is Bas Hoksbergen. I'm Architectural Market Manager at Pharos, and I'll be your host today. I'll mainly be operating in the background and support where required. Today's webinar will be presented by Ryan Sainsbury, Technical Project Specialist at Pharos. The aim is to have a 15-20 minute presentation and then a Q&A session afterwards to answer any possible questions. At the bottom of your screen, you'll find a Q&A button. This can be used to ask any questions for today's topic. There should be a chat button, but I noticed that is not visible today, so just use the Q&A button with any question. If it's a one-on-one question, I'll reply to you personally. At times, we might do a poll to ask you some feedback. An example, this one, and let me share that with you. So you should see a pop-up on your screen. You will not see that when you're logged in via a browser. So we'd like to ask you to, well, let us know if you ever have used priorities and if the quality seems to be okay. While this poll is running, there seems to be a mixed audience of users, from very new to more experienced users. If you are new to Pharos, some of the features might go a bit quick today. But unfortunately, we don't have the time to do a full training in these 20 minutes. It will be possible to review this webinar afterwards as well. And I'd just like to point out that on the Pharos website, there are some good tutorial videos for those people who are very new. But we'll do our best to make sure this is accessible. I see a raised hand, and I will reach out to you one-on-one. Thanks everybody for answering this poll. Let me just share the results with you. If that's no, technical issues today. I have the result of the poll, but I can't share them with you at this moment. I'll suggest we just go on, and I'd like to thank you all for your answer. And let me over to Ryan, and let's get started with this webinar.
Thanks for that, Baz. Okay, I'm just going to quickly take control. 1 second. One second. There we go. Hello guys, welcome. My name is Ryan Sainsbury. I am a technical project specialist for Pharos Architectural Controls. Just welcome you all today to our webinar. Just as Baz mentioned, the webinar from Tuesday, if you missed it, is now up online on our website. So if you didn't have a chance to go and see that, please obviously do. And then, yeah, as Baz also said, we'll have a Q&A session at the end for you guys to ask us questions. I'll do my best to answer them. So today's webinar is all about integrating with an emergency system and how you can do that with a Pharos controller. So I've split this webinar up into 3 parts. There's the emergency systems, where we just talk about the typical kind of systems that you'll be integrating with and some of the basics. Then we're going to be talking about timeline priority and also how you can group timelines as well, which is a particularly useful feature for this type of programming. And then finally, what I'm going to do is I'm going to then just give you some demonstrations and some examples within Designer as to how you can take the top 2 things and then, of course, implement that into your programming. So let's go ahead. Let's look at the basics of integrating Pharos with an emergency system. So first of all, I just want to state that, we're not an emergency manufacturer or an emergency system manufacturer. You should always reach out to your emergency system manufacturer and find out what is the best way to integrate with their system. But typically speaking, the integration between an emergency system and Pharos is normally very, very simple. So the typical types of integration that you'll see will be something as simple as maybe a contact closure relay. So that's just a circuit that's open and closed. Obviously, depending on the state of the circuit, it'll either set the alarm off or it'll be there to reset it. One of the key things, though, is that typically the integration between Pharos and a emergency system should have the least or minimal points of failure as possible. Obviously, as you can imagine, if you've got lots of devices between Pharos and an emergency system, if one of those goes wrong, it creates a point of failure, which could be a potential issue. And then finally, emergency systems are tested very often. I think that ours are tested once a week at our office in London. And obviously, once that test has been completed, it should be very easy for your customer to just restore normal playback. And I'm going to be showing you how you can do that as well with our timeline priority. So the first thing that I really want to move on to today is the timeline control. So if there's one thing that you take away from this webinar, it's just to remember this. You should always set your emergency lighting scenes within Pharos Designer to a high priority. And what this effectively means is that if your emergency lighting scene, your timeline is running at a high priority, any other timelines, any other lighting scenes of a lesser priority cannot override that emergency system or that emergency lighting playback, which obviously is very important. So just to recap, we have different priorities within Pharos. There's 5 in total, which I'll show you, and I'll show you how to assign them to a timeline, but just have your emergency timelines set to high, and then any other timelines or lighting scenes set to a lesser priority. Also, it may be that you need to set specific timelines to a group. So for instance, let's say that you have timelines or lighting scenes that are lighting a particularly key area, something like a fire exit or maybe a stairwell, and maybe at night time when you want to shut off all the system and you want to release 10 or 11 different lighting scenes in different zones, you may want to say to the system, okay, I want to kill all playback except from the key areas. And you can do that with grouping timelines or scenes into a specific group. So for instance, let's say you've got your 10 areas running, as I've just said, and then you've got your stairwell or your fire exit lighting scenes. You would literally be able to group those lighting scenes for the key areas into a group A, and then you can say to the system, release all except from the timelines and scenes in group A. And of course, making sure that you do that correctly with your programming, your release all action within Designer is very key as well. And again, we'll kind of go through that. So I'm just going to show you the basic setup that we're working with today. So as you should be able to see on your screen now, we have a training box, a demo box in the bottom right-hand corner. The back panel is essentially just a set of LEDs, which I can show you some output on. And then we have 2 controllers. We have a TPC, a touch panel device on the front left of the screen. At the front right side of the screen, we have an LPC, a lighting playback controller, and the inputs, the relay inputs on that LPC are then connected to the switches at the back. So the very first switch, which I'll point to in a minute, is going to be our emergency system. So this switch here. And obviously, when I flick that switch, it will then engage the emergency system. And then when I flick the switch the other way, it will then disable it. So I've set my project file up today with 4 different areas. There's the first area, which is your typical downlights, then maybe a chandelier area, a special area, or speciality fixture area, I should say. Then we've got like a typical media facade, but it's these fixtures in the middle that I really want to focus on. These are going to be our stairwells, so this is going to be a key area that we need to make sure is lit all the time. And again, I will show you how to do that a little bit later on. So I've got a couple of lighting scenes. The first 2 lighting scenes that I've got represent our day-to-day playback. So we've got a morning scene, and then we have like an evening scene. And then we have a special event scene, followed by an emergency scene, just so we're clear, that is all fixtures just going to 100% white. And then finally, we have our stairs scene. So as I said previously, the most important thing is that you always make sure that your emergency lighting is set to a high priority. And that's just so that any timelines or other lighting scenes with a lesser priority cannot override that lighting playback once it starts. You can do that by going to the Manage button at the top here. And then from the drop-down option, you'll see that you have 5 different priorities: high, above normal, normal, below normal, and low. And typically speaking, the way that I would go about doing this is obviously to set the emergency timelines to high, but any special events timelines that you have, maybe New Year's Eve, something like that, I would set those to above normal. And that's going to make sure that it always overrides the day-to-day programming, but of course the emergency programming, were that to kick in on a special event, that would then obviously take priority. Just so we're clear, while we're on the subject of priorities as well, we have something called latest takes precedence, so that if you have lighting scenes of equal priority, so like they're all set to normal, effectively what happens then is it's the last timeline or last lighting scene to be selected that will then come on stage or come out of your fixtures. Also, I should also notice that timelines and lighting scenes within Pharos never release unless they are told to. So effectively what you create is a stack of timelines. So if timeline 1 is selected, that goes to the top of the stack, and if timeline 2 is selected, that then goes to the top of the stack, and then timeline 1 will then just slot in underneath it. That is obviously with the exception of priorities, which I've talked about already, which mitigate that latest takes precedence rule. Okay, so I'm just going to come on to the triggers that I've set up within our show file today. So typically speaking, a relay or a contact closure input will be integrated with Pharos via the physical inputs on a controller or maybe a remote device. And if you want to then set that up as a trigger within Pharos, you can do so using a digital input trigger. This covers both the contact closure and also if you have just a power supply on your relay circuit as well. So one thing that I should mention is this has two states that we're going to be looking at today. There is a low event, which can be selected here, and there is a high event. So that just points to the resistance in the circuit. So obviously if the resistance goes low, the circuit is closed, and if the resistance is high, then the circuit is open. So it just means open and closed. So when the input goes low, it will start the emergency timeline, and then of course when the input is high, it will then just simply release it. So I'm going to go ahead now and I'm just going to click on the box underneath me, and then I'm going to show you obviously what that looks like. So there we go. I've got the high priority timeline now running. And also if I just demonstrate to you that we have that timeline running now, but I'm going to start one of my morning scenes, you'll notice that the output in the box does not change. However, it does run, it just runs inactive, which means it's running but behind the system. And now, hopefully, if I flick the switch the other way, the emergency timeline will stop, and then it'll go back to our kind of normal playback. So there you go, a very easy way of resetting your playback so that it just goes back to your playback that it was doing before. So I hope that was helpful for you. One other thing that I want to look at though is just grouping key areas within your project file. So again, let's say that we always want to make sure that our playback turns off at maybe a specific time, or maybe from a press of a button, which I'm going to demonstrate on the TPC in a little bit. But of course, we need to make sure that areas within areas with key lighting scenes, such as fire exits and stairwells, do not become disturbed. So again, just to quickly demonstrate this, I obviously have the morning scene running at the moment. I then have my stairs scene as well. You'll notice that when I fired the trigger from the web interface, actually both timelines run at the same time. But I've grouped the stairs timeline into a group which can be selected from the management drop-down options. So here I've selected group A. And now if I go back to my trigger window, you'll notice that when I hit the button on the TPC, it will then release all timelines and scene except any that are in group A. So I'm just going to go ahead and give that a go now. I'm going to press the TPC's button. And there you go. You can see that the playback has stopped. If I go to the web interface, you can see that both of them have been released. So the only thing running is the stairs, which is currently then holding at end. So I hope you guys found that useful. Please do give us any kind of questions that you may have. But again, just to give you a quick summary, it's really, really important that you remember that emergency timelines should be set to a high priority. That means effectively any scenes with a less priority cannot override them. And that what you'll need to then do is obviously physically release that emergency timeline with obviously some kind of trigger. And of course, if you have key areas within your system, it's best to group them and then obviously have that release all action, release all of your playback whenever you need to, except for the group of timelines or scenes that you have to have running in key areas. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to Baz.
Yeah, there is a question actually from Mark, and I'll just read the question. Does it go back to a previous timeline prior to the emergency? Or, well, does it work in a different situation? So can you further detail that one.
Yeah, okay, so let's just focus on that for a bit. So, as I said, we never release timelines within Pharos unless you physically tell them to release. So, if I start timeline number 1, that plays, and if I then start timeline number 2, that will then play, but timeline 1 will then sit underneath it in the stack. With high priorities, basically what actually happens is they just jump to the top of that stack. And if you have any timelines playing previously, once you release that highest priority timeline at the top of the stack, it will then obviously reveal back to whatever's underneath of it. Kind of think of it a little bit like layers in Photoshop or layers on a cake. If you were just to take off the top layer, then you would be left with whatever is underneath, and it's the same way. Obviously, you need to have some timelines playing underneath, and again, just so we're really, really clear, if you have a high priority timeline to start with, and then some normal timelines start, they will then just slot underneath that high priority timeline.
So because Pharos is a system that can support multiple timelines, it will just be multiple timelines running, but with priority, you can influence, you can indicate which timelines are important, which you prioritize the output over other timelines that might be running.
That is correct, yeah.
There was a question before coming in about how this is different from ACN priorities.
So good question. So this is timelines that are internal, lighting scenes that are internal to Pharos. I believe that ACN priorities. Let me see if I can find that really quickly. I
can otherwise add to this as well.
Yeah, sure. While I'm setting up, go for it.
Exactly. ACN priorities are defining a fixed priority on the network. So let's say you have the Pharos controller as a source, but you also have an other controller as a source. This ACN priority number defines which source to use. What we just showed you today is the different timelines within Pharos. So internally in Pharos, how those take priority.
Yeah, correct. And just so we're aware, if you need to set a SACN universe priority, you would do that in the patch window, which I'm currently showing you right now. Yeah.
Then there's another question how to, if you also want to turn off the power to your fixtures, so the mains power to those fixtures, how might Pharos be able to integrate that?
Well, that's a really good question. So we do have a Rio device that is capable of controlling outputs, but I believe its maximum voltage is 48 volts. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes.
So obviously, you could have a Rio control the power going to a fixture, but obviously the 48 volt limitation is there, and you can't really use more than 48 volts because you'll blow the output. So typically speaking, we can do integration with lots of different things, such as UPSs as well. A lot of UPSs now have smart features where we can send a command over a serial connection or network, and obviously that can then control the power. But yeah, as I said, if you want to do it straight from Pharos, then you obviously need to be wary that you can do it with a Rio output, but it needs to be under 48 volts.
I've actually one more question myself, which I'm not sure if you would be able to answer this now, but sometimes an alarm system is sending you when the alarm activates and when the alarm stops. But would it be possible in Pharos, or how would it be possible to make sure that the user needs to reset the system? So only at the fire alarm says, or the emergency alarm says there's an emergency, it starts the emergency timeline, but then afterwards the emergency system says it's all clear, but you want as a user to manually stop that emergency timeline. Is that possible, or how can we do that best?
Yeah, of course it is possible. So typically speaking, you can have conditions set up within your programming, right? So let's just quickly go back to triggers page here. You've got a digital input, which obviously starts the alarm. Brilliant. You don't want any conditions on that because you just want it to kick in. But then what you can do is maybe you can have a button that disarms the alarm from the lighting scene from the interface, but then you can check a condition. So I'm going to go ahead and set that up for you now. I've actually got a button for this called turn off within the emergency system. Okay, so you've got a button on your interface. That's going to be your button to kill the system. But in order for it to obviously check that the alarm has actually ended, you can simply have a condition. And that condition will check a digital input. So you just set it to the input that you want, and then obviously the correct state. So it'll run like this. They press the button. Obviously, if the alarm system has been reset, then of course you will then be able to release the emergency timeline.
Thank you. This was exactly what I was looking for. I also noted another question comes in, and I think I'm going to take the liberty to answer that, because it's saying we are controlling emergency fixtures, and that is not what we're doing here. I mean, what we are talking about here is using the firewall's controller to be supportive to an available emergency system. By nature, just the way how DMX works, or ACN for that matter, that is all not systems that you should use for, let's say, the official security systems. That said, people seem to very much appreciate it when an emergency system kicks into a building and all the the emergency lighting that should do the emergency lighting is doing the things it's doing. But additionally, the fancy and the atmospheric lighting is also indicating that there's an emergency going on, and that's not trying to make it a nice ambient, but that's indicating that there is an emergency status happening in the building. So firewalls and DMX, we can be supportive to DMX to emergency systems, but we are not a primary emergency system. Okay. We have a few more minutes. Are there more questions or anything else people might want to share at this moment? Because if not, then I think I'll be taking over again. And let me just do that.
Oh, we've just had a question come in.
That's a good one.
Is there any fail-safe setting on Pharos? Could you potentially give a little bit more context, fail-safe, as to what type of fail-safe specifically are you looking for? Power fail-safe for the controller, for relay inputs, DMX data?
Yeah. A bit more information on this question would be appreciated.
Is Pharos not connected to this? If Pharos is not connected to a central power. So
I guess that, for example, the situation when we are connected to a UPS or something like that.
So no is the honest answer. You can power Pharos in two ways, and I have seen people sometimes make this mistake, and it's not recommended. But you can power Pharos with either PoE, power over Ethernet, or you can power it via mains. You cannot power it via both, or you shouldn't, because you could potentially short the device. Obviously, Pharos is a lighting control system, and I think it's really, really important to point out that you should build a system around your lighting control system. So, as Baz has already mentioned, a UPS that powers the systems is definitely the best way to go when looking at this type of thing.
Yeah, maybe to add to that, what we have seen happening is where the Pharos is connected behind the UPS. So even if the power fails, the controller will still run, but because it's connected to the UPS, it will receive a trigger from the UPS when the mains power goes away, and therefore it can start to dim the lighting, or it can turn some lighting off, by sending out the other DMX values.
I mean, you could even just add to that again. Obviously, we kind of talked about this in the previous webinar that, our IO module library is becoming really extensive now. And as I said kind of earlier, UPSs are quite smart. They can send us commands. You can even send us a command, and then you can link that to something like an IO module, which will then send you an email, or there's various different options that you can have there for the notifying of whether or not that's happened.
Okay. And I think I'm going to take over the screen again. Let me double check this is all going right. So yeah, thanks for this presentation, Ryan, and everybody, thanks for your questions. We really appreciate those. If a question comes up after the meeting, of course, you can always contact us at support@firehousecontrols.com. After this webinar, you will receive a small survey where you can provide feedback and suggest other topics for webinars, because your feedback on this and your suggestion for topics is very much appreciated. With this, we'll be ending the webinar. So I'd like to thank you for your attendance, and we hope to see you next time.